Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True. And today is the 8th day of July. That is 2024. Going to be reading a book today I've discovered and wanted to start it and basically wanted to share some information about it. This is a book, a gentleman named let me see if I get his name right because I don't want to tell you wrong. Tom Harpur, spelled Harpur. The name of the book is simply called The Pagan Christ. And I want to read basically a couple things here from the book here. So let's get into it. Let's see. So, why the name Pagan Christ? Well, quote, this is from Alvin Boyd Kuhn, and this book is based upon Alvin Boyd Kuhn's work. That is, Tom Harpur, who did this book in 2004. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years ago. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn passed away in 1963. So I would assume that Tom Harpur probably is a little older. That is, he might have been born in the 1950s or 60s, whatever. But anyway, he wrote this book. So this is a quote from him, from Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Simply is, thousands of souls in the pagan world were on fire with the pure flame of the divine passion of the Christly love centuries before Jesus ever lived. End quote. So before we begin, there is something you must know about the title of this book. The word pagan is almost totally misunderstood today. The deeply pejorative use of the word, entirely due to Christian prejudice and bias for centuries, is illustrated at once by the concise Oxford Dictionary almost brutally, meaning heathen, unenlightened, or irresistible, or irreligious person, end quote. So you can see that as a total biased perspective. Christians saw themselves as far more superior to these people. That's my interjection here. They did. They felt that pagans were just country bumpkins. They were stupid in their point. So, but the citation goes on to admit that in its origin, the word was totally neutral. It comes from the Latin pagus, P-A-G-U-S, a country district, a pagan, capital pagan, a pagus, or initiative was a peasant. The term was soon to be used by the emerging church authorities to note all who were not Orthodox Christians. As we shall see, the word pagans, who were persecuted, decried, and killed, and ultimately utterly banished by the church. Correct. Held views of the Christ within which the church was to plagiarize blatantly, and then covered up with book burnings, anathemas, and murder. Ironically, centuries later, it was to the pagans, that is, to the pagan Aristotle and his teacher Plato, that the church was finally forced to turn in order to save its theological, quote, bacon, end quote. The monumental work of Thomas Aquinas, which is the foundation of Roman Catholic theology, and based upon Aristotle, including it, this whole theory of natural law testifies to that. So that's the end of the quote. And this is the book here called The Pagan Christ, chapter 1, called Discovery, a Bible study I've never heard before. My point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. This is from John Dominican Crossan, C-R-O-S-S-A-N. This is from a quote from him, simply called, Who is Jesus? One day in the late 60s, while I was teaching at the Toronto School of Theology, which was called Wycliffe College, which naturally was, I would assume, is named after Wycliffe in England, who was a Protestant, and as well as I recollect, him and Tyndale were part of, I think Tyndale was part of the writing the Bible, and I think Wycliffe was also involved with that. Don't hold me to that. This is what I remember in my seminary days. A very bright English student at Victoria College in the University of Toronto came to my study with an urgent matter to discuss. She was the daughter of a friend of mine and was enrolled to an undergraduate course taught by Northrop, Northrop, Frye, Frye, a course for which he justly renowned. Her problem was that her rather conservative evangelical faith was being deeply challenged. The towering scholar, later to become internationally known in particular for his classic books on the Bible, was telling his classes with all the usual wit and verve that the Bible was not a document concerned with history, but a vast collection of sublime myths and metaphors. Yeah, this is what's going on. People think this is real history, and it's not. That's what Phil Langdon and we have talked about also, how people have been completely blind to this. And so was I. So was I. I went to seminary also, but I knew there was something wrong. But let's continue on. Though I was far from following any form of fundamentalism, I remember trying to reassure her, that is not without difficulty, that there was indeed a profoundly historical core to it all. That had been my background, you see, and had suited the college ethos as well. At that time, I knew very little of Frye's actual thinking apart from her report. 15 years passed before I read the newly published, quote, Great Code, and then its sequel called Words with Power, and came to a much fuller understanding of what Frye truly had to say and what Bible language really was all about. The experience and his words were in the back of my mind all through the months of research that went into the writing of this book. I found myself in particular recalling Johann L. Aiken lines in the introduction to Frye's last work that is called The Double Vision. Quote, in a legendary undergraduate course, that is, Aiken wrote, quote, Frye reminded his students that when the Bible is historically accurate, it is only accidentally so. Reporting was not of the slightest interest to his writers. They had a story to tell which could only be told by myth and metaphor. What they wrote became a source of vision rather than doctrine. In all my readings ever since, I have found that observation to be wise beyond any view of Scripture I had ever read before. It is understanding that it is vital to this exploration. Let me say that I write here, as in all my work, as a journalist with special training in theology and religion. I have the great responsibility of sharing the, quote, story, end quote, that follows with as wide as audience as possible, because what I describe and document in the following pages is one of the most far-reaching tragedies in history. Well, it's worse than a tragedy, folks. Far worse. It is the premise of this entire account that very early on in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that is, in the Christian era, the Christian church made a fatal and fateful error, either deliberately in a competitive bid to win over the greatest numbers of the largely unlettered masses, or through willful ignorance of the true inner sense of the profound spiritual wisdom it had inherited from so many ancient sources. You see, the church took a literist, popularized, historical approach to sublime truth. What was preserved in the amber of allegory, it misrepresented as plotting fact. The transcendent meaning of glorious myths and symbols were reduced to a farrago of miraculous or irrelevant or quite unbelievable, quote, events. Yes. The great truth that the Christ was to come in man, that the Christ principle was potentially in every one of us, was changed to the exclusive teaching that the Christ had come as a man. No other could match him or even come close. The Dark Ages and so much more were the eventual result, correct? While most of what is laid out in this book will possibly surprise and stir both faithful and outsider alike, that is not my primary intention. This book is not about seeking controversy or even headlines. It is a sincere and earnest search for spiritual truth. Certainly it is in no way meant as an attack upon Christianity or any other religion for that matter. Quite the opposite. In fact, in the end, it is about the realization of a richer, more spiritual faith than I ever knew before. I want to affirm with the utmost emphasis and sincerity from the very outset that the evidence investigated here, the discoveries I have made, and the inner struggles and deep insights that have flowed from them have made a joyous and life-changing imprint upon me. When I first began my investigation, I thought to myself, quote, can any of this be true? Several months later, I found myself asking instead, what if it is true? The implications were enormous. It meant, you see, that much of the thinking of much of the civilized West has been based upon a, quote, history, end quote, that never occurred. And that the Christian church has been founded on a set of miracles that were never performed literally. Finally, though, I said to myself, because of the sheer weight of the evidence before me, yes, I believe it's true. And that has made all the difference, a huge and immeasurable positive difference for my understanding of my faith and my own spiritual life. Simultaneously, it has transformed my view of the future of Christianity into one of hope. Just to anticipate a little, here's why I can say that with conviction. You will find that the allegorical, spiritual, mythical approach to the Bible and to the Christian faith, that is, the true spiritual Christianity, before official Christendom took over, solved the enigmas of Scripture and the Christos story as nothing else can do. Bible stories come alive with amazing new freshness, believability, and power. Our own potential for Christhood and for experiencing the indwelling Spirit of God here and now sounds forth in a clear and relevant message for everyone. Hope for a true cosmic faith is kindled and fanned into a full flame. There is a theological grounding given for our own institutional yearning for a faith that resonates with our own matter, the natural world. Our fresh yet ancient moral universe understanding of the Jesus theme opens up doors to other faiths that Orthodox Christianity, as it is now, can never hope to pass through. And that's not all. Seen in their new light, the rituals of Easter and Christmas, along with the Christian symbols such as the cross and the Eucharist, glow with renewed significance and depth. In all honesty, however, this has not been a simple or easy journey for me. Coming from a Judeo-Christian background and a commitment and dedicating my life to making known spiritual truth, I have never before encountered in depth the kind of challenges to my own faith I explore here. Certainly very little of what follows was ever presented to me by the institutional church during my 10 years of university training for the Anglican priesthood long ago, nor was it ever once seriously discussed by any of my colleagues during the roughly 10 years I spent as professor of New Testament and Greek at a prominent Canadian theological college. It was assumed by all throughout the traditional Christianity had always been more or less what it is today. Its superiority over other religions was seldom, if ever, seriously challenged. Of course, I had read the great anthropologist Sir James George Fraser Golden Burrow, written between 1890 and 1915, which compared the religious findings. I had read Plato and Aristotle in Greek at the University of Toronto and again at Oxford, and had studied both Orpheus and mystery religions. Yet, few, if any, of the Egyptian parallels to the gospel writings examined here ever came into my view. The similarities that existed between Christian beliefs and the early pagan religions were always quickly passed over in seminary as foreshadowing, end quote, of the good news proclaimed in the New Testament, like the various prophecies, end quote, and prototypes in the Old Testament. Similarities in previous religions were represented as having been wholly, quote, fulfilled in Jesus. Nobody even suggested the opposite might be true, that the Bible in general and the New Testament in particular actually copy or repeat motifs laid down by many centuries, and in some cases many millennia before. I was aware of Sigmund Freud's harsh-sounding dictum that the Bible was a, quote, total plagiarism, end quote, of the Sumerian and Egyptian mythologies, but I had dismissed this as a gross distortion typical of the founder of modern psychiatry, as well-known bias against all religions. I had also once read Dr. Anna Bonus Kingsford's opinion that the, quote, Hebrew sacred books, end quote, were all, quote, Egyptian in origin, end quote, but I had quite arbitrarily dismissed it as nonsense. When I started my ministry in the parish, and even when I was teaching at the seminary, I had absolutely no idea many of the startling truths you are about to encounter. For example, I didn't fully understand the nature and relevance of what I now call a, quote, a true myth for early Christian religious thinkers. That myth is more eternal in its meaning than history. It would have been used to mean that Moses is an Egyptian name, as in Romos or Thunmos, and even that there was a Jesus in Egyptian lore many thousands of years ago. His name was Isus, I-U-S-U or I-U-S-A, according to Jerome Massey, and that means, quote, the coming divine Son, S-O-N, who heals or saves, end quote. So he's using two great people. I recommend people to read. Anything by Jerome Massey is great, and anything written by Alvin Boyd Kuhn is also great. They're worth the read and the time. They're worth it. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn has written probably 50 or 60 books. Some of them are short, some of them are deep. But yes, continue. And that means the quote, the coming divine Son who heals or saves. Okay, so I knew nothing then of a Egyptian Christos or Christ named Horus. See, this is where the whole idea here, Horus is just a repeat of story here, somewhat. He and his mother Isis were the forerunners of the Christian Madonna and Child. Together, they constitute a leading image in Egyptian religion for millennia prior to the Gospels. Eric Hornigan says there was a, quote, obvious analogy between the Horus child and the baby Jesus long before Christianity. Isis had borne the epitaph, quote unquote, mother of the god, end quote. What a different kind of preaching and teaching I would have done had I realized that this mythical Horus anticipated by thousands of years most of the sayings of the miracles of Jesus Christ, that too had a supernatural birth, and that in one of his roles he was, quote, a fisher of men with 12 followers, end quote. I would have made a profound difference to me to know that piercing the literal sense of the Bible to reveal its hidden, allegorical, and mystical inner core could free us up and offer new transformative spiritual vistas and insights. For example, imagine my surprise at discovering during the research for this book that Martha and Mary figure in a story about the raising from the dead of Lazarus or Lazarus at a Egyptian Bethany about 4,000 years ago. The, quote, miracle described in John's Gospel was never a historical event. Instead, it was a recurring, deeply archetypal and widely used symbol of God's power to resurrect the dead. There is so much more to explore and share. Most potent of all has been the increasing knowledge I have gained, or how the key early Christian doctrine, the incarnation of spirit in human flesh or matter in each of us, is in fact the oldest, most universal mythos known to religion. It was current in the Osirian religion in Egypt at least 2,000 years BCE. But I anticipate, in any event, I can promise the reader this: I have indeed found myself in the course of all the emotional, intellectual wrestling involved in coming to the grips with this material, not just a deeper faith, but a far more bracing, more intellectual honesty, more tuned into the universe itself kind of belief system than I ever dreamed possible. I see my Christian faith with a transformed vision. What I have written is not intended primarily for scholars, although I hope they will be deeply challenged and learn from it too. While I have the greatest respect for scholarship and will be drawing upon the work of experts in my field, as well as my own training and experience, I have dedicated my entire professional career as a theologian and a journalist to the attempt to make complex issues as simple as possible for ordinary intellectual lay people. The scholars have their libraries and their own hidden sources. Many of them, it seems, can communicate only with one another. Indeed, some of them may like it that way. But the result too often has been, and still is, that ordinary traditional citizens, the majority of any society, have been ignorant or left to pick up whatever crumbs they drop from the academia table. This is never more true than related to matters of theology, to religious beliefs and doctrines. Much, perhaps even most, of what is contained in the book has been known to some comparative religious scholars for years, even since the 1799 discovery of the Rosetta Stone on the western bank of the mouth of the Nile River by Colonel Broussard, an officer in Napoleon's army, an event that made possible the first discipling of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writings. But some combination of fear that is vested in the church interests and the belief that some things should not be left to the hoi polloi to discuss at all, convinced many of their experts over the years to keep virtual public silence. They know the potential for controversy and hostility from the ecclesiastic and other powers that be, as well as from those many rank and file church members who fear change more than anything else. Whenever any of the material had been moved seriously, others have rushed to crush it, dismissing it summarily or labeling it as rank heresy. They quote, well, usually out of context, whatever Bible verse seems to prop up their position. Yeah, that's a great one, what they do. What the late comparative religion scholars and linguist Alvin Boyd Kuhn has called the, quote, the shadow of the 3rd century, which I read out probably 2 or 3 months ago, maybe longer than that, still makes its sinister presence felt. The church today stands at a crossroads. Many of its best thinkers are warning that it may have only one more generation before extinction because of its failure to communicate meaningful with a postmodern age. Yeah, the churches are dying, folks. People are moving away from it because they know it's not true. It doesn't make any sense. The sad part probably would be the boomers are probably the last group that actually believes this stuff. Richard Holloway, former primus of the Scottish Episcopal Church, rightly notes that the spiritual longing of modern men and women have never been stronger. But he says, quote, the end of Christianity is coming because there is a system undergirding the traditional economy of salvation, which is more concerned with preserving its own power than exploring the truth, end quote. Yeah, they don't want to know. They know, but they don't want to share, so to speak. Or they simply don't know. My own thinking and experience confirms this. The answer to this crisis lies in a proper understanding of where and how everything began. However, engaging in this endeavor reveals some extremely disturbing facts. The blunt truth is that seismic research by a few specific neutral scholars, most notably Orientalists and Egyptologists, have been deliberately ignored by churchy authorities for many decades. Scholars such as Godfrey Higgins, Higgins, who lived from 1771 to 1834, author of the monumental tome called Anacabius, the British Egyptologist, Gerald Massey from 1828 to 1908, and more recently and more importantly, the already cited American specialist in ancient sacred literature, Alvin Boyd Kuhn from 1881 to 1963, have made it clear in voluminous, eminent, learned works that the Jewish and Christian religions do indeed owe much of their origins to Egyptian roots. Certainly, a full appreciation of the huge contributions such experts as Higgins, Massey, and especially Kuhn have made to finding a fresh understanding of religion in general and Christianity in particular is long overdue. These men and their scholarship challenge present Christianity to the core, and yet, without question, offer a radically fresh and hope-filled way ahead. They were men far in advance of their time. Through it all, though, they believe firmly in the presence of a divine power or cosmic mind behind and throughout the universe, and in the survival of the soul after death. I personally owe them a lot more than I can ever say. Godfrey Higgins will always have a firm place in comparative religion study because of his massive 2 volumes, Anacabius, an inquiry into the origins of language, nations, and religions. It was to have a profoundly formidable influence upon Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Many years later, it stands as one of the most learned and far-ranging studies of the origins of religion I have ever encountered. First published in only 200 copies in 1833, it was the final product of many long years of study. Gerald Massey was a man of vivid genius and poetic fire who distinguished himself as a social reformer, a poet, and especially an Egyptologist. His poetry won the admiration of both Tennyson and Ruskin. His fame, however, rested mainly on his 6 monumental volumes that dealt at length with the mythology and religion of ancient Egypt. He studied the extensive Egyptian records housed in the British Museum because he was there. He worked there, folks. And taught himself to disciple the Hieroglyphics. Yeah, he taught himself. Although he was a capable lecturer, his speeches and books were not widely circulated. The record shows that his controversial work was considered taboo in what were regarded in the day as respectable literary and religious circles. Of course, it was. No one would really want to hear this, you see, because they're still not aware. They were holding on to this. He was nevertheless light years ahead of his time. I found the writings and research of Dr. Alvin Boyd Kuhn to be the most erudite, most elegant, and most convincing, both intellectually and intuitive, of any modern writer on religion I have ever encountered in lifetime dedicated to such matters. To meet him through his books and monograms is to be confronted by a towering polymath whom history has yet to recognize fully in all his brilliance. Yes, no one really, this guy is hardly even known. Kuhn's second book, called The Lost Light, published in 1940s, was a stunning, exhaustive exposition of the allegories, parables, personages of biblical Christianity, and of the basic foundation of all religion. It is unquestionably his single greatest contribution to a rational, convincing, highly illuminated understanding of what the ancient wisdom was really all about and where religion, especially Christianity, should be going today. I have a signed first edition of the book on my desk as I write this. Printed on the title page are the words, quote, "This book will be to religion what Darwin's work has been to science," end quote. A quotation from the president of the National Library Board of America. Kuhn's book had never been given the wide recognition they so deeply deserve. Amen. He simply stepped too often and much too hard on too many powerful toes, particularly those of the vested religious institutions and their hierarchy keepers. Far from being an original contribution to the world of religious thought, as the scholars have convincingly shown, Christianity was turned into the early centuries into a literary copy of resplendent spiritual forerunner. I will clearly document that there is nothing that Jesus of the gospel either said or did, from the Sermon on the Mount to the miracles, from his flight as an infant from Herod to the resurrection itself, that cannot be shown or have originated thousands of years before in Egyptian mystery rites and other sacred liturgies, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Everything from the star in the east to Jesus walking on water, from the angel's pronouncement to the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, from the temptation in the wilderness to the changing of water into wine, already existed in Egyptian sources. Hear me? Those were already in the Egyptian sources. Egypt and its people had knelt at the shrine of the Madonna and Child, that is Isis and Horus, for many long centuries before any allegedly historical Mary lifted a supposedly historical Jesus in her arms. But for all those centuries before the translation of the Rosetta Stone by Champollion in 1822, the ancient key to all this Egyptian material had been lost. Of course, no one knew how to read hieroglyphics. That's what happened. That's why no one knew. This has been kept, in the dark, so to speak. Centuries of blissful ignorance went by. Now, since the translation of the books of Old Egypt, that is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Pyramid Texts, the Amadot, and the Book of Thoth, for example, there is irrefutable proof that not one single doctrine, rite, tenet, or usage in Christianity was in reality a fresh contribution to the world of religion. Kuhn puts it tersely when he says that the entire body of Christian doctrine is simply a revamped, mutilated Egyptianism. These may seem extremely blunt words, but a full reading of his works reveal the mountain of undeniable evidence he has to back them up. The cross, as we shall see, was a feature of ancient religion for a vast span of time prior to the Christian era. But imagine my surprise when I discovered that something universally believed to have been a purely Christian innovation, the Greek monogram comprising the first two letters of the word for Christ, C-H-I, Chi, and Ra, Ro, R-H, Chi-Ro. Letters often superimposed on each other in church ornamentation. Yeah, it's also taught in seminary, was also pre-existent to Christianity. It appears on the coins of the Ponius and even those of King Herod the Great. Almost 40 years BCE, Herod was made king of the Jews by the Romans in 40 BCE, and he reigned until 4 BCE. The Egyptian Constantine the Great put this monogram on the larum, or standard of his legions, after his famous victory at the Milvan Bridge 300 years later. Thus, He linked the church to his political military power, and all who rebelled against the new Catholic or Universal Orthodox were labeled heretics. In his introduction, that is, into Who is the King of Glory, one of the deliberate, neglected, and yet most learned expose, Kuhn says that the entire Christian Bible creation legend, the descent into the Exodus from Egypt, ark and flood, allegory, Israelite history, Hebrew prophecy and poetry, and the imagery of the Gospels, the epistles, and the Revelation are now proven to have been transmitted from ancient Egyptian scrolls and papyri into the hands of later generations who didn't know their true origins or their fantalist meaning. He asserts that, quote, long after Egypt's voice, expressed through the inscribed hieroglyphics, was hushed in silence, perpetual relics of the Egyptian wisdom were their cryptic messages utterly lost, were brought forth to the world by parties of ignorant zealots as a new body of truth, end quote. Only by fully acknowledging and regaining in parenthood in the sublime pagan sources will Christianity rise and last to its intended true nobility and splendor, he argued. As we shall see, the church of the 3rd and 4th century, when challenged by his pagan critics as to the real sources of its gospel, dogma, and rites, reacted with fierce hostility, systematically hunting down and eliminating all trace of any pagan past. It hounded anyone, whether Christian or not, who bore witness to the old truth. You hear that, folks? It's like book burning, you see. But they disposed of these people. I'm sure they killed them. I know they did. I don't think. I know. I know that Augustine was involved in all this stuff, even later. It closed down the traditional, that is, the, quote, pagan, end quote, philosophical schools, persecuted those involved in the various popular Greco-Roman mystery religions, burned hundreds of thousands of books, and hurled the charge of heresy with its penalty of excommunication. And any who threatened to question the Orthodox party line, many were put to death. The pagan inheritance was everywhere hotly denied. This was the beginning of a violent process that was to recur over the centuries and eventually in a Christianity that Fry once bluntly describes as a, quote, a ghost with the chains of a foul historical record of cruelty clanking behind it, end quote. Studying this attempt to squelch the truth in detail for the first time was a profound shock for me. Today, there is no longer any excuse for any hierarchy to ignore the truth of what has actually transpired. The record is now plain for all to see. Not only did the early Christians take over almost completely the myths and teachings of their Egyptian masters, mediated in many cases by the mystery religions and by Judaism in its many forms, but they did everything in their power through forgery and other fraud, book burnings, character assassination, and murder itself to destroy the crucial evidence of what had happened. In the process, the Christian story itself, which most likely began as a kind of a spiritual drama, together with a, quote, sayings, end quote, source based upon the Egyptian material, was turned into a form of history in which the Christ of the myth became a flesh and blood person identified with Jesus, that is Yeshua, or Joshua of Nazareth. The power of the millennium-old church mythos to transform the whole of humanity was all but destroyed in the literary adulteration of a, quote, presumptive Galilean paragon, end quote. Centuries of darkness were to follow. I have labored to present this work as clearly as possible, yet in places some hard work will be required, and readers must be prepared to think on their own and to be open to fresh ideas. It might well be a good idea to keep a Bible at your hand in case you want to check a reference for yourself. But this isn't essential. Keep in mind throughout that however negative, even shocking the evidence may seem at times, a vast hope shines through it all. The overwhelmingly positive conclusion finally reached point towards an exhilarating new approach to faith and a sorely needed, truly spiritual Christianity in this still very new millennium. My goal throughout is not to summarily dismiss the deep beliefs held by many millions of North Americans, Europeans, and increasingly now in the Southern Hemisphere, where the vast majority of today's Christians live. But I do want those people to think deeply about their faith anew. Once the, quote, surgery, end quote, is over, you will see with me how the Bible is wonderfully illuminated afresh, how a rational cosmic faith not only is possible, but indeed is the only thing that makes sense in our fast-changing, pluralistic world. You will learn how we future faith must and can be fully grounded in nature and its cycles. The Jesus story will come alive and strike you heart and intellect as never before. Traditional rituals such as Holy Communion, baptism, and the church key festivals of Christmas and Easter will have new power once we understand their true meaning in the light of the ancient wisdom. This narrow, universal belief and glorious destiny beyond the grave will be grounded once and for all and is something more solid than a merely pious or emotional-based faith. Belief in the Christ within will be established as the key to personal and communal transformation. Our journey begins. So that is the end of chapter 1, and I wasn't going to go any further than that, so we're just going to stop here because it's probably about 30 or 40 minutes here. What is it saying here? Hold on a second here. Yeah, it's roughly that. So we're going to stop at this point. Again, this is a book called The Pagan Christ by Tom Harpur, Harpur. And next we'll do chapter 2. Thank you for being here and wish you a good day. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care.